So we're here to hear from Trina, and particularly because her book, Performing Silence, about women in the group theatre movement in India, is about to be published by Oxford University Press. I've been really lucky to have been allowed a view of the proofs, and I'm about halfway through and enjoying it immensely. I wanted to just read you a little bit from the introduction, which I think sets up what the book does really, really well. So Trina describes her project as writing a gendered history of the politics of this movement, vis-a-vis its announced ideologies, its representational structures, its norms of masculinity and femininity, and its gendered ordering of labor, agency, and desire. It's a fascinating read about the gendered political economy of theatre making and the gendered representations that it produces in the context of one of the most interesting and engaged radical theatre movements of the 20th century. Today, Trina is going to talk from the book about the playwright Utpal Dutt. So I'm going to hand over to her to present, and then we will get back to a discussion when she's finished. Thanks, Trina.
Thank you, Tom. Am I audible? Yes. All right. I'm very grateful for this invitation, and the book, of course, has been a long time in the making, and now that it is done, it seems quite unreal, in fact, that it is finally, leaving my hands and going into this kind of unpredictable space where anything might happen to it. But I mean, this is one of the first talks that I am going to be having about the book, and it's on the eve of its release. So it should be out at the end of the month, this month, in fact, unless there's any further delay. And so this particular paper that I'm going to be presenting today is from the chapter 4 of the book, which looks at not just at Utpal Dutt's work, but really the sort of the political context of the emergency in India, and especially in Bengal, and the events that sort of build up to it. And it looks sort of at the work of Shambhu Mitra as well as the work of Utpal Dutt to look at how, in fact, revolutionary agency is conceived in sort of deeply gendered ways. So I'll go on straight to the paper. I'll speak, as Tom said, for about 40 minutes, and then we will hopefully have sort of some questions, discussion on Tom, could I just request you once again to just tell me when I have 5 minutes left, and so I can begin wrapping up.
Yeah, sure. I'll break in rudely with 5 minutes to go.
No, that's that. I won't want you to do that. All right. All right. The paper is called Utpal Dutt, Labor, Revolutionary Organization, and the Question of Love. This paper will attempt to look at the trajectory of Utpal Dutt's work as a Marxist playwright within the group theatre movement in Bengal through the 1960s and 70s, concentrating on two primary aspects. First, it will attempt to trace his careful fashioning of the figure of the organic intellectual as a dramatic character in his plays. This figure appears almost like a leitmotif in Dutt's work. From this, in Dutt's work from the late 1950s onwards, providing the primary impetus towards, as well as direct pedagogic training in revolutionary organization. From Ongar, written in 1959, to Tir, written in 1967, the organic intellectual in his plays develops in depth and complexity, transforming in character from a young male mining laborer to a tribal woman who educates herself in revolutionary literature in order to become a teacher of the Red Book for her comrades. Besides strong persuasive abilities and the ability to organize revolutionary groups, what these characters are endowed with, irrespective of gender, is a high degree of sophisticated technical and military knowledge of the coal mines, for example, of how to steer a ship, of how to lead a guerrilla army. They are defined by an intense love of their own work. However, while the love of labor seems to aid the process of revolutionary organization, what seems to complicate its smooth functioning is the love between men and women. The second question this paper will engage with is the problem of revolutionary love. What is the place of desire in the time of revolution? In Tir, 1967, a play written about the revolutionary peasant movement sparked at Naxalbari in Bengal, Dutt seems for the first time to frame a political problem without knowing the solution. Neither the text of class war nor the grammar of women's empowerment within the revolution is able to justly tackle the problem of love. I attempt to examine Dutt's grappling with this radical question. A brief introduction, which kind of also gives you the premise of the book and how it relates to this particular, section of the argument. So writing a political history of the group theatre in Bengal has involved looking at a movement that was in no way cohesive. It grew without a manifesto or a unified aesthetic impulse and harbored many separate, even conflicting articulations of political intention. The Bengali group theatre developed in independent India from the late 1940s onwards, finding its strongest roots in the city of Calcutta, but spreading out throughout the eastern state of West Bengal. At least in the period between the 1950s and the 1980s, the movement was chiefly driven by a broad leftist ideology. It drew manifestly on the ideological legacy of the Indian People's Theatre Association. The artistic and activist work of the IPTA had inspired thousands of cultural workers across the Indian subcontinent in the 1940s. However, the largely amorphous nature of the group theatre in post-independence Bengal allowed for the not always peaceful coexistence of many divergent political cultural strands, ranging from the broadly progressive and patriotic to the violently radical. It is difficult to determine with any degree of certainty the source or origins of the movement's nomenclature. Group theatre was the name that this movement eventually acquired, but various other names had competed for their rightful place in the history of this movement, including Navonatto, a name generated by Bohurupi, one of the first important theatre groups to emerge out of the IPTA in the late 1940s. Navonatto, which meant quite simply the new theatre, perhaps also contained an oblique sonic reference to Gononatto or People's Theatre, the child and rival of which it happened to be. Other names included somewhat peculiar coinages like Shotnatto or Honest Theatre. However, it is the less formal group theatre that seems to have survived the test of time. Interestingly, the name referred then not to the content of the theatre concerned, but rather to its organizational structure. There's more about this here, about the possible origins, but I'm skipping over it. Perhaps the one thing that might go some way towards holding the different faces of this cultural conglomerate together was, surprisingly, the peculiar nature of its economic organization. The economic structures that continued to dominate the group theatre for almost 50 years drew primarily from the ideology of the Indian People's Theatre Association in the moments of its first articulation in the 1940s. Malini Bhattacharya writes in her essay, The IPTA in Bengal, that the theatre movement in Bengal struggles to establish the performing arts on an alternative economic basis from the thriving commercial theatre. And this is entirely due to the tradition created by the IPTA in the 1940s. The movement is not confined to sporadic amateur efforts with a restricted audience of the initiate, but has deep, far-reaching roots even in the remotest corners of the state. However much the hundreds of small theatrical groups may differ from each other in their specific political persuasions and their modes of experimentation, and this part is important, they still put up a solid common front against large private ownership in the sphere of the performing arts and the cultural values it represents. This too is largely a legacy of the IPTA. So this assertion against a solid common front against large private ownership was something of a general fact till the 1990s, at least till the 1990s. Along with this, because of the particular nature of West Bengal politics between the 1950s and 1970s, there were also widespread reservations about accepting funding and patronage from the cultural institutions of the Congress-run government at the center, which continued more or less till the coming of the left-run government to power in Bengal in 1977. After which the left theatre movement received a considerable amount of support comparatively from the CPM-run state government, Communist Party of India, Marxist. Malini Bhattacharya writes of how the activities of the IPTA in the 1940s lead towards a wholly new conception of the relationship with the consumers of culture. The idea of the People's Theatre implied a novel cultural relationship between the urban middle classes, workers, and the rural poor. It was a theatre for, of, and by the people, where people, not excluding the urban middle classes, were envisioned not simply as the consumers, but also as the active producers of culture. Still, the People's Theatre was at this juncture an ideal yet to be achieved. This ideal, when achieved, would mean that the people as consumers of culture would no longer be a faceless mass sitting passively in the cozy darkness of the auditorium, but their relationship with the producers of culture would be one of continuous and active exchange. In spite of this, the imagination of the middle class cultural activist as a vanguard individual who must first activize the imagination of the rural masses in order to bring them into a continuous active exchange with their urban counterparts was a pervasive one in the within the cultural front. For the undifferentiated faceless mass at the receiving end of culture to be transformed into an active and engaged people, the IPTA was required to emerge as a necessary transformative force. For the rural poor to engage culturally with the thinking urban middle classes as also produce their own cultural work, albeit transformed by socialist modernity, it was necessary for the cultural front to step in as mediator and vanguard. Bhattacharya also remarks that for the performing arts to be freed from commercialization, it was necessary for the economic base of contemporary Indian society to undergo a complete structural change, a situation that had not yet come to pass. A cultural field that would be free from the laws of the market and the effects of commodity fetishism was the utopian horizon of the People's Theatre. It was an idealized projection into the future towards which all present forces were required to struggle. Now, this struggle could not be complete unless the ownership of the products, both material and cultural, came to the people themselves. In India, in the years immediately preceding 1947, the notion people had to be extended to mean not just the urban proletariat and the industrial workers, but the large bodies of the rural poor and agricultural laborers who populated the villages. And this would perhaps explain the IPTA's consistent attempts to engage with folk forms and practitioners in the mid-1940s. Bhattacharya goes on to write that the organizational character of the IPTA enabled it to explore alternative cultural formations still prevalent in non-urban areas and to establish a link between the traditional and the contemporary. The idea was for cultural activists to go to the people and to activate them to create new theatrical forms for themselves. So the People's Theatre was necessarily a political idea that needed to be activized in the here and now. This meant nurturing a new kind of professional ethic which completely deprioritized commercial concerns. The conception of artistic work as revolutionary labor of a certain kind entailed that cultural workers functioned like party whole-timers who could work both as missionaries / political laborers who went among the people and as creative professionals. The issue at stake here is not whether all the cultural front workers at this time found themselves committed to the communist or the revolutionary cause. Indeed, some of them arrived as broad progressives and or nationalists simply wishing to empathetically address the immediate suffering of the masses during the Bengal famine, but the modality of work and discipline that the IPTA championed in the sphere of arts. Combining missionary zeal with serious discipline meant that financial constraints, however severe, appeared unimportant in the face of the sheer force of ideology. The economic reality of practicing art in an impoverished post-colonial polity, of course, has never been quite smooth sailing. But in the group theatre, this hardship acquired the affective force of a certain kind of a mission. This fervor continued to exercise itself forcefully through many decades, drawing its strengths from the memories of an ideology, the actual content of which had turned somewhat distant. While the contradictions within the Indian left continued to unfold, culminating in the crisis of the Naxalbari in 1967, the theatre movement in Bengal continued to assert its allegiance to a broadly leftist politics. The operative word here, of course, is broad. In the 1950s, a large strand of the movement participated in the progressive rhetoric aimed at national social reconstruction, which sat well with the project of Nehruvian welfarism. Another more subterranean strand of resentment against nationalist bourgeois government and its cultural collaborators continued to bubble under the surface euphoria surrounding independence. This is the strand that emerges increasingly dominant around the mid-1960s to the 1970s, starting with the split in the party in 1964, following on to the successive events of the failure of the two United Front governments, the Naxalbari uprising, the two instances of president's rule, and finally the national emergency from 1975 to 1977. Interestingly, the trajectory of a political transition from progressive to revolutionary can sometimes be traced in the work of individual playwright directors in Bengal. In an interview with A.J. Gunawardena, published in the Drama Review 1971, Dutt makes it clear that by progressives, he means middle-class intellectuals. He says of his own 1959 play Ongar can be at best called a progressive play, and I consider them progressive damaging, derogatory, almost abusive. Progressives can never talk revolution, they will only sympathize with the revolutionary from a distance, close quotes. On the question of revolutionary theater, he says, revolutionary theater is essentially people's theater, which means that it must be played out before the masses. The audience is our first concern, matters of form and content come second. A genuine revolutionary play put on before an intellectual audience in the city is irrelevant because the intelligentsia simply won't change. Essentially, the revolution is first for workers and peasants. Revolutionary theater must preach revolution. It must not only expose the system, but also call for the violent smashing of the state machine. I mean, when I read this, I definitely think of, Benjamin and Still Stella and the pulling of the brakes, etc. And I don't know if he had this in mind, but this is the image that he uses, the violent smashing of the state machine. And this is, of course, I think, an interview given in the late 1960s, and then, it gets published in 71. So the interview, the interview was recorded in Calcutta in November 1970, soon after Dutt's foray into Naxalite politics and his staging of the more or less directly Maoist play Tir. The idea of progression here is done away with in favor of a violent rupture. By the 1960s, disillusionment and distrust of Nehruvian socialism within the critical strands of the Indian left ensured that the term progressive had taken on an unmistakably negative connotation for radical cultural practitioners like Dutt. While in sharp contrast to the far more positive implications of progress during the years of the United Cultural Front in the 1940s. So while revolution as an image of violent rupture continued to return intermittently in leftist cultural discourse, the notion of a theater for, of, and by the people persisted undeterred. The idea of the people contains separate historical, political, and chronological imaginings at different junctures of Indian political history. The people as a political placeholder bore a rich potential for multiple significations, being mobilized as an aspiration and as a reality in every street corner and proscenium. The imagination that accompanied this mobilization could shift between several registers: the nation's unified citizenry, the urban middle class, an imagined proletariat, or the masses of rural India. As a flexible discursive effect, the people could be brought to bear on various political agenda, a Congress nationalist speech, in the trade unionist address, or in the graffiti painted by a young Naxalite revolutionary. Whether or not the IPTA had indeed successfully mobilized popular elements in the 1940s, a compassive nostalgia subsequently created the moment of the first sort of, radically successful play, Nabanno's staging in Bengal in 1944, as one in which the interests of the people nation had been courageously articulated by a political theater that could unabashedly speak its own name. So the bewilderment at the loss of this people nation, that imagined and remembered moment of unity, and the consistent attempts to return to the same, thus constantly militated against the demands for a forward-looking loyalty to the state's narrative of national progress. And I discuss this more at length in the book when I talk about what comes after this. This nostalgia was also in evidence in many of the films of the period, perhaps especially in the work of Hrithik Ghatak, for example, in Komal Gandhar, 1961, and in Shubhanarekha, 4 years later. So, and I discuss Komal Gandhar at length in chapter 2. So by the 1970s, the emptiness left behind by this loss began to produce frequent nation, the other face of that remembered utopia. The tensions between these two contrary poles shaped the trajectory of Bengali group theatre in the first 3 decades after independence. So, right. So I'm just going to skip over a bit here. So the variously inflected and often amorphous notion of the people continued to function as the horizon towards which leftist cultural work oriented itself. The people as an idea that could be used severally provided a sense of political directionality or telos to a heterogeneous cultural movement and signified its and justified its economic and organizational structures. But in reality, while people remained in the imagined and ideal addressee of much of the political discourse generated in and around this theater, the Bengali group theater at this time shaped itself as primarily a middle class cultural enterprise, both practiced and consumed, with rare exceptions, by the urban middle class. Two simultaneously utopic horizons, then, and idealized projections towards a society with radically changed economic relationships, and an aspiration towards an imagined audience of the oppressed masses who articulated their political resistance as a people through this theater, continue to shape the internal conflicts that plague this movement. Yet, there could not but be the awareness on the part of critical practitioners and spectators of the limited political reach of this kind of middle class art practice. The repercussions of this critical self-reflexivity and the resultant intermittently dogged attempts at reaching the ideal of people's theatre were various, and this includes Utpal Dutt's radical experiments with the Jatra in the 1970s. For now, I would like to point out that this struggle at the heart of the group theatre movement led through the 60s and 70s to several experiments in creating a professional theatre that was simultaneously economically viable and politically committed to the cause of the masses. It appears that to study urban group theatre in Bengal between 1950 and 1980 is to attempt to imagine an organizational and theatrical space which emerges from a core duality. Such a space of political performance practice is marked by being constantly at the crossroads, torn between the complex and centrifugal pulls faced by a middle-class art theatre when it attempts to become an actual theatre of the people. The resultant approximations and failures, as well as the occasional political and aesthetic plenitude, are at the core of the critical work that follows. So, Utpal Dutt and the Gender of Revolution, Kollol, Ongar, and Tir, 1959 to 1967. This is a condensation of a very long section of chapter 4. So I apologize at the start if certain things seem unclear, and I'm sure if there are specific questions, we can take it up in the discussion. Tom, how much time do I have now left?
You have, sorry, just looking, you have 15 minutes.
All right.
Sorry, 15 minutes until my warning, so 20.
20 minutes, okay, that's good. All right, so right on to Utpal Dutt and the question of revolutionary agency, female revolutionary agency specifically. The figures of revolutionary women that appear in Utpal Dutt's plays from the late 1950s to the early 1970s are often individuals who have stepped out of their usual gender roles and taken on the mantle of political activism and leadership. They seem, however, they seem to have given up conventional notions of sexual chastity, and these notions are questioned at many junctures in these plays. To be revolutionary in the struggle against class oppression seems to be the only thing necessary to turn women into political heroes. These plays seem to be primarily about class war, but Dutt still engages himself closely with sexual politics and gender relations, questioning at several crucial moments in the text the laws of property that seem to govern conjugal relationships. Dutt's women are sharply different from the dominant models of women in mainstream theatrical and cultural representations at this time, but not uncomplicatedly so. They're exceptional in the amount of revolutionary agency allowed to them for the time in which they're created. However, if one were to come down to numbers, perhaps women in supportive roles were far greater in number than revolutionary women on stage, even in Dutt's texts. I will concentrate primarily on three of Dutt's landmark plays written in, here I think I will have only space for Kollol and Tir. So, but the three significant plays are Ongar, 1959, Kollol, 1965, and Tir, which was written two years later. These plays demonstrate, in my view, the development of his singular intent to create a revolutionary theatre. In this period, he moves from plays of radical critique and exposure of bourgeois exploitation towards plays that begin to teach directly the methods of revolutionary actions. And this kind of resonates with the interview that we heard from given in 1970. In the three above plays particularly, there is also a growing concern with creating the right sort of revolutionary protagonist who would form the basis and the fulcrum for the most effective revolutionary organization. Interestingly for us, and unusually for the time, questions of gender and sexuality are often foregrounded in this exploration. Dutt engages himself closely with the problem of female revolutionary agency and its relationship to values governing sexuality in Kollol, in Tir, and several other plays from the time. Kollol was first performed in Minerva Theatre in Calcutta on the 29th of March in 1965. The play was based on the incident of a well-known naval mutiny against the British by the sailors of the ship Khyber, which had caused much popular uproar in the 1940s. In the play, the revolutionary protagonist Shardul Singh and his rival in Rav Subhas Desai have a prolonged discussion on the nature of love and conjugal relationships in the middle of the mutiny. I will quote from this passage at sort of considerable length because this is important to what I'm about to argue. So Shardul is in the middle of the mutiny. His wife is now living with Subhash, who's been crippled by the war, and Subhash is not really a revolutionary of the kind that Shardul is. And this conversation happens between these two men. So Shardul says, "What do you want to say?" Uh, Subhash says, "Lakshmi has told me to tell you that she is waiting for you." Shardul says, "It's best not to talk about all this in the battlefield." And I will just ask you to pay attention to these two lines. Shardul says, "It is best not to talk about all this in the battlefield." Subhash says, "We might never have the chance to talk of all this again." Shardul then says, "Then go back and tell Lakshmi that you cannot win Shardul with such inanities." Subhash, "You don't understand, Lakshmi. That's why you're being so merciless." Shardul, "I thought you were just a messenger. I had not realized you would comment on the message too." Uh, these are mostly, these are all of them are in fact my translations. So Subhash says, "I apologize. Shardul, as a soldier, I respect you, but in my personal life, I will make no compromises with you. I can understand that Lakshmi has done right. Why would she not choose a man of steel like you over me? But in spite of that, I do not have the power, the education, or the decency to turn noble and forgive everything." A moment's silence. "Tell Lakshmi one more thing. Tell her remember what I told her before I left. There is no other way to come back to me." Subhash laughs. Subhash laughs out and he says, "She has to murder me and send you my blood. I will tell her. But know this, that Lakshmi can do even that. She can do anything for you. But there is no doubt that you're an extremely regressive man in your private life." Shardul says, "Regressive?" Subhash says, "Feudal. One who knows that his only rights over his wife are that of love can never make such medieval statements. You think your wife is your property. It hurts me to believe that the leader of such a great struggle is such a backward man in this respect." Shadu says, "Don't talk too much. Don't go so far. My pistol was with me." Uh, Subhash says, "It would be fortunate to die on the deck of Khyber." Shardul, "Come, comrade, come rest a bit." And then again, there's a moment of silence. And finally, Shardul says, "Come, comrade, come rest a bit. I hope you're not cold." Subhash, "Not at all. Have you had a change of heart?" Shardul, "Are you mad? But for now, you're a guest on this ship." Shardul and Subhash embrace and they exit. This single exchange marks out a complex modality of relationships between two men who are comrades in a revolutionary war. Their political and personal roles vis-a-vis each other are clearly at odds, but this is not the only thing noteworthy about the dialogue in the above passage. It is my contention that Utpal Dutt marks out in the process of mapping this conflict two different notions of masculinity, both heroic and revolutionary in their own way. The primary and declared objective of the play Kollol, if one were to put it very simply, was the construction of an alternative history of India's struggle for independence and the systematic exposure of what Dutt clearly saw as the widespread and insidious fabrication that formed the basis of the Indian National Congress's bourgeois version of the narrative of nationalism. The point was counter-propaganda to uphold the communist version of the same history. However, it seems to me that along with this historical epistemological project runs a parallel concern. That's evident desire as a dramatist is to create a full-bodied revolutionary hero, not a superhuman prototype of perfection and greatness that alienates the audience, but a personality rich in internal conflicts and ambivalences. This particular anxiety about being able to create a psychologically complex and intentionally imperfect proletarian hero for his epic, propagandist theater, is reflected in several of Utpal Dutt's essays about political theater. For example, in Towards a Revolutionary Theater, he writes, "In myths, good and evil are simple and straightforward, because myths were created by people who produced for their immediate needs and lived in each of the objects they produced. In an alienated industrial society, production by human hand is obscured by complex processes, and good and evil are no longer sharply delineated forces. Epics cannot grow in these conditions." Skip over this a bit, and she then says, "We have watched plays by communist groups where the communist hero appears as a superhuman Captain Marvel without a blemish on his character, advocating war or peace according to the current party line, laughing in the face of danger, and generally being as big a bore as a guru. And one comes to the conclusion this man is not even a subject to sexual desires or a cough or cold." This concern with End of quote. This concern with the creation of a deliberate faultiness in the revolutionary hero animates many of Dutt's plays written and performed in this time, and resonates strongly with his trenchant critique of asceticism within the Communist Party. In Kollol, Shardul Singh, an Indian sailor in British employment, arrives home in 1946 after having been away for 2 years without any news to find his wife living with another man, Subhash Desai. He reacts predictably with anger and outrage, rejecting the advances and pleas of his wife Lakshmi Bai, who still seems to be emotionally devoted to him. Shardul seems to be the epitome of the virile and valiant masculine leader of the sailors on Khyber, a good soldier and fighter whose ego is deeply hurt by what he sees as his wife's shameless infidelity. Desai, by contrast, and on the surface of it, is a far more imperfect man. Once an accomplished sailor, he is now physically disabled and incapable of fighting, having lost one of his arms to the German army in the Second World War. Subhash now lives with Krishna Bai and Lakshmi in their house, Shardul's mother and wife, and Krishna seems to be fond of him, but his relationship with Lakshmi is fraught with guilt and anxiety on her part. But even in the midst of all this, that takes care to establish the fact that as comrades in a class war, Shardul and Desai are allies rather than enemies. Desai betrays no resentment or jealousy of Shardul's qualities and seems to be full of admiration for him. And in the scene on the deck of the Khyber with which we began this section, where the two men directly confront each other, Shardul too seems to be able to overcome his all-consuming sexual jealousy long enough to appreciate the fact that Desai is a man of steel in matters of the heart. That seems clearly concerned here to stress the fact that revolutionary conditions necessitate a different order of personal relationships, where redefinition of the word personal becomes necessary. I try to examine the implications, which can be both liberating and constraining on separate occasions, of this process of redefinition for the organization of gender relations and women's agentive roles within the revolutionary framework that maps out. It is crucial to point out here that this proposed redefinition affects not only conventional conjugal relationships and sexual rivalries, but also intimate family relations, such as that between mother and child, even between neighbor and neighbor, and crucially between comrade and comrade. And I feel that the last is a relationship which stands in a strangely complex space between the traditionally personal and the traditionally public, as both somewhat of an affective bond and a professional contract. In fact, it is this relationship of comrade to comrade that is an overriding standard and measure, rather something of a touchstone for the ethical success of all other relationships. As Dutt attempts to establish repeatedly within the framework of his plays, it is those personal and private relationships that manage to pass the test of good comradeship that are worth having at all. Self-fulfillment is set against petty selfishness, and while Dutt's critique of revolutionary failures is never scathing, he makes it clear that it is only genuine commitment to revolution that can transport personal relationships towards true fulfillment. So therefore, even though Shardul is a great revolutionary hero, he remains petty and feudal in his personal life. Lakshmi Bai is led by her selfish love for her husband to sort of into betraying the revolution. So which is both an ethical and a strategic failure, according to Dutt. So right, so Shardul's own mother, Krishnabai, criticizes his judgment of Lakshmi according to the conventional notions of chastity and wifely devotion, seeing such values as essentially feudal. Both Krishna and Desai make the same point that thus reiterates in several of his plays, that for the proletarian woman, ideals such as chastity and honor cannot come before the needs of physical survival. So Krishna Bai actually chastises her son. She says in this one scene, Shardul, go and show your valor on the ship, not here. And her son says, you're all against me. Why didn't Lakshmi commit suicide to save herself? And his mother says, why aren't you committing suicide now? Shardul says, all that doesn't suit me. And Krishna says that, but it must suit Lakshmi. What justice? And then Shardul says, why are these people in our house? Pointing to Shubhash, she's not your daughter-in-law anymore. Why do you let her stay? Krishna says, my wish. This is my house. She's my daughter. I can't throw her out. Shardul says, in that case, I can't come to this house anymore. And Krishna then, stunned but serious, says, all right, Shardul Singh, but Lakshmi stays here. So she chooses to have Lakshmi in the house rather than her own son. So, and there is a discussion here which we can come back to in the Q&A session of how this sort of trajectory of this kind of sort of narrative in Manik Bandyopadhyay's work, in his short stories, especially Chine Khani Gano from an earlier sort of couple of decades back, and that trajectory kind of it kind of loses that strand of kind of sexual radicalism in a certain way, loses force in the movement, and it comes back on Utpal Dutt's work very interestingly. I'm not getting into this now because of the lack of time. So let us now go back briefly to the passage from Kollur with which we began this section. Shardul says it is best not to talk about all this in the battlefield, and Subhash responds with, we might never have the chance to talk of all this again. It seems to me that these two lines can be read as a clue towards both Dutt's dramaturgy and his gender politics in Kollur. Dutt's declared desire to create a political theatre that would tap the imagination of the masses, and his readiness to use for this purpose without hesitation all the popular devices of entertainment, formal surprise, and grand spectacle are very much in evidence in Kollur. So the action is fast-paced with one dramatic event following another in rapid succession. But Kollur is the story of a spectacular battle in many senses. But given this kind of strategical astuteness that has as a playwright and his orientation towards creating a fast-paced, engrossing drama, it seems an unexpected decision for him as a dramatist to allow Subhash and Shardul to have this conversation in the middle of the battle. So I think this actually sort of, acts as evidence of the fact that Dutt had a kind of singular revulsion for the kind of political radicalism that refused to shake off its Bhadralok moorings in quotidian life, and the different standards that it had for men and women in sexual matters. And he seems to say that, and then there are sort of, bits from towards the revolutionary theatre where he says that the pity is that even after the Indian petty bourgeois has orally embraced Marxism-Leninism, he still holds fast to Gandhian ideas and disseminates them in everything he writes. So unashamed derogatory remarks on the spectacles of women smoking or dressing in trousers reveals this medieval mind. So there is all of that in Dutt's work. So in a sense, sense, and this argument also appears in, earlier in the book when I look at sort of, Shruti Pradhan's comments on one of the early sort of members of the IPTA. But the thing is that in a sense, it seems to suggest that Dutt is insisting that this conversation about the relationship and the organization of power in sort of sexual relationships and relationships of desire must be had in the middle of the revolution and not later. So if we look at these lines spoken by Shardul and Desai, we see that Shardul's point is precisely that there are more crucial things than love at stake on the ship. This is an argument that was often made, that we can talk about all this later. So these discussions can wait. Desai's answer as Lakshmi's messenger and the bearer of her crisis perhaps closely represents Dutt's. The discussion on the nature of communist love, on the ordering of personal relationships within a revolution, and on the fate of women tied to the old morality must be had now, in the midst of the revolution and not later. It cannot wait. And so Subhash says we might never have the chance to talk of all this again. This is, if anything, a Gramscian answer. Base and superstructure tied together in a dialectical and mutually transformative relationship, simply seizing control of the Khaibar has not produced in Shardul a revolutionary transformation that allows him to extend his radical generosity to his wife as comrade, and without which the resistance may indeed be a failure in the end. As we may say, it is because it is Lakshmi's desperate and frustrated love for Shardul and her utter failure to communicate with him that leads to the final revolutionary blunder. So that actually ties this together in the plot. So
5 minutes.
5 minutes? Yeah. I'll be done in 5 minutes. So deeply influenced by Gramsci, Dutt too creates in his plays many characters of the sort of in the mode of the organic intellectual, often splitting up the functions of the organic intellectual into one or more characters in ways that threads of similarities between which can be traced from one play to the next. Read as a prescription, Gramsci's formulation works in two ways. The new intellectual must not simply think and orate, he must act, organize, labor, while all the time being defined by and defining his own organicism, consisting in an awareness of the nature of his relationship to the world of production and his organic function in the fundamental social group to which he belongs. Besides being a permanent persuader, Gramsci's organic intellectual of the working class gives to his social group from which he arises a homogeneity and an awareness of its own function. He also bears a certain directive and technical capacity as an organizer of masses of men. In addition to this, the organic intellectual of the working class embodies a novel coming together of intellectual and physical labor, or the physical and social world, aimed at a general sort of practical activity, which is perpetually innovative, and the foundation of a new and integral conception of the world. And there's a longer discussion of this in the book and the specificities of this, but I would like to argue that in Kollur, that the figure of the organic intellectual is split into two, in the person of Subhash Desai and Shardul Singh. If Shardul exemplifies the permanent persuader in his organization and directive abilities, Desai embodies a radical cultural transformation that is just as crucial for the revolutionary class. But it is the figure of Krishna Bai, the exemplary female revolutionary, that stands out in her ability to truly represent a complete metamorphosis in the sphere of the personal for the sake of the collective, in keeping with the new communist morality, perhaps reminiscent in a way of how early Marxist theorists like Alexander Kollontai had defined it. Communist morality encourages the development of many and varied bonds of love and friendship among people. The old ideal was all for the loved ones, and communist morality demands all for the collective. Interestingly, when the mantle of the organic intellectual is carried forward in Dutt's later play Tir, it is a revolutionary woman, clearly in the tradition of Krishna Bai, who fits the bill. Debari in Tir stands out as an unusual and striking figure, a woman whose organizational and directive capabilities allows her to take on the revolutionary pedagogic function, not just in relation to her community, but perhaps more radically in relationship to her husband, Jonaku, whom she educates. The pedagogic hierarchy of the bourgeois companionate marriage is hereby reversed. And so this bourgeois companionate marriage, Sahadharmini, etc., is discussed in chapter 2 2 and 3, so it kind of refers back to that, is hereby reversed with difficult results. Debari is faced with a consistent emotional and physical violence from her husband, perhaps as a punishment for the very education she imparts to him. However, as she soon emerges irrevocably as one of the leaders of the Naxalite revolution within the tribal community, to an extent that Jonako finds it impossible to deny her influence for very long. Jonako is her husband. In one of the most intensely etched scenes of violence in what is indeed an extremely violent play, Debari's husband tears up her books while also beating her up severely. To Debari, it is the violence done to her books rather than the physical violence inflicted upon her that remains an unhealable wound and the cause of an almost permanent rift in the marriage. Dutt's commitment to creating pictures of revolutionary communities split apart by internal strife and conflicts is an aspect of his desire to consistently highlight the urgent need for cultural transformation if revolutionary organization is to take a truly cohesive shape. Failing to communicate within her marriage, Debari turns utterly silent inside the familial space. However, as the community slowly begins to prepare itself for guerrilla warfare, Debari's voice emerges with the strongest revolutionary clarity. Of the other voices that surround her in the preparation for armed conflict, the most articulate are those of women. This is quite unique. In a section of the play entitled Mao Zedong in China, Chinta, the ideas of Mao Zedong, we find scenes of revolutionary training enacted on stage. Here we see that simultaneous classes in martial and theoretical education are in progress. So while Shanzhou Orion, a title reserved for women, Gabriel, Monglu, and Upashu practice archery under the culvert. So it's like this sort of vast scene with diverse sort of simultaneous sort of events taking place together on the stage. So while some are practicing archery, several others, including Gangi, Jonako, and Debari, attend a class on Mao Zedong's Principles of the People's War, held by the leader Debidash in the jungle. That creates a panoramic landscape on stage where, once again, like in Kollur, several scenes can be enacted simultaneously, and the whole community rather than an individual protagonist is in focus. The division of the play into scenes that have separate titles, especially ones like Mao Zedong et Chinta or the ideas of Mao Zedong, once again emphasize for us the pedagogic intent of the play. And I do a section on how this might be sort of reminiscent of Brecht's idea of the learning play or the Lehrstücke, but I'm leaving that out here. The class on Mao's thoughts on guerrilla technique and methods is meant not just for tribals on stage. That seems to mean to turn the theater into a classroom for revolution. The episodic nature of the text is directly related to its pedagogic intent, reminiscent of Brecht, like I said, of his didactic or learning plays. The scene is not one that only simulates a class on revolutionary warfare, it is a class on the methods of people's war. All the 10 principles of operation enumerated by the Little Red Book are in fact listed by Dutt verbatim on stage in Bengali translation, including the one directing the people to educate themselves in times of rest between subsequent battles. So this is a scene of rest and education between subsequent battles, which also teaches the audience. Many of the Debidas's words to his students consciously counter the then popular arguments against the institutional left against revolution. And he insists that it is a spurious argument that India is not ready for revolution because large parts of it are backward. He insists that the revolutionary time is in the here and now. There is a sense of immediacy in this pedagogic exercise that differentiates it from earlier plays like Kollur. The play was to Dutt perhaps the cultural mouthpiece of a revolution in progress. Think of Naxalbari, rather than a revolution to come. Dutt's deliberate attempt to highlight the female revolutionaries' agency and expertise is clear in is clear in the revolutionary time, as Debari emerges during the course of this scene in her full-blown directive and persuasive capacity as the organic intellectual of the revolutionary community. But even as Debari proceeds in teaching and arguments, another scene of persuasion is enacted simultaneously across the stage. So I'm ending now, this is the last bit. So here is Debari teaching from the Red Book to her comrades, and simultaneously another scene is lit up on the stage. And I'm going to end by talking about this scene. The text skillfully juxtaposes these two scenes, one definitely Leher and like Leher Strucker, and the other not so undisguisedly that. Gangi, who is another woman from this group, from this revolutionary group, who is Gojua's wife and one of the women who explains the techniques of revolutionary warfare in the teaching scene, it's said on stage, and we learn that she has been raped a few days earlier by a man called Shoni Charua. Shoni Charua has emerged to save himself from Gojua's wrath by taking shelter in Gangi's brother's house and by invoking an ancient tribal custom of asking refuge in the name of Mahakal, eternity. At present, Gojua, Shoni Charua, and Gangi are all part of the revolutionary army that is under the leadership of Devi Dash. Even as she has participated in her training, Gangi has appeared melancholy and distracted through most of the teaching scene. In the middle of the class, having handed over the duty of teaching to Debari, Devidash calls aside Gojua and his wife Gangi, and this is the scene that begins. Devidash says, Gojua, listen. Gangi comes up and stands with a faraway melancholy look in her eyes. Gangi, this is a war. This is revolution. Should we fight so pettily amongst ourselves in the midst of this? I've emphasized this section. Gangi does not move, so Devidash goes to her. Forgive Shonicharo. Look at it from this perspective. He's a child. He has made a mistake. Gangi, pointing to Gojua, says, tell him. Gojua says, Devi, comrade, I say it every day. I have no more anger. I mean, there is, but deep inside, it will never come out. Because there is so much work, there is war at hand, we need him. He draws maps, draws mountains and rivers. Our small griefs and sadnesses, all this now. Devi says, say something, Gangi. Gangi says, pointing to her husband, ask him to go and I'll tell you. And her husband leaves immediately. On Gojua's departure, Gangi confesses to Devidash that she is actually in love with Shonicharo. The reason she has forbidden her comrades to bring him to the meetings is that she sees him. If she sees him, she may fall in love with him again, and maybe this time she may not scream when he touches her. Devidash is dumbfounded at this answer, and further persuasion proves unnecessary after such a revolution. It is my argument that while one Lehestuka-like episode is in progress, that simultaneously etches another one for us, where the terms of debate are notions of chastity and honor, but this time on the part of Devidash, it is to erase the fact of violence from the event of rape. It seems from Devidash's stance that all arguments can be subsumed by the overarching event of the revolution and the exceptional nature of the revolutionary time. The same exceptional time that liberated Krishnabai from feudal notions of chastity and allowed her to articulate Lakshmi's injustice, demand that Gangi refrain from defining her experience of rape as violence. Rape, like chastity, is remolded in the time of revolution as a childish mistake and the cause of unnecessary infighting amongst friends. One cannot but be reminded, and I saw that she's in the audience, Mallarika Sinha Roy's work in gender and radical politics in India, and recognize how close this sort of erasure was to reality, where women's experiences of violence within revolutionary organizations were often written over by events that seemed larger than themselves. To quote Shingo Rai, in the magic moments of Nakshalbari, women's memories of moments of nightmare, experience of violence and repression are intertwined with visions of emancipation. So that sort of makes Devidas say all this, but there is no conclusive resolution to the scene quite. At a more subterranean level, however, what was more disturbing to me and what I'm trying to point out here, what appears to be even more disturbing than the deliberate attempt by Devidas, who's a very much middle-class progressive intellectual activist, to silence the event of rape as a fact of revolutionary time, is Gangi's mention of the word love. For the first time in all these texts, Dutt, playwright and pedagogue, seems to frame a problem without knowing a solution. It seems to me neither the text of class war nor the grammar of women's empowerment within revolution is able to justly tackle the problem of love, in spite of Dutt's insistence on the discussion of it in the here and now. Gange's admission of love can only be met with utter silence on the part of Debidash. The question remains, how does one speak of love within the unequal relations of power that continue to exist between man and woman, relations which make rape possible but love impossible? What sort of revolutionary cultural transformation can address this kind of pathology? Gange's confession does not erase the fact of heterosexual violence from the text of revolution. Instead, her articulation of love turns it more horrifying. One is made to wonder what the corollary of revolutionary war in this violent relationship between the sexes could possibly be, given that the mere utterance of the word love succeeds in stopping all further discourse. Debidash's silence reflects that's own, perhaps signaling at the fact that that at least to this revolutionary question, that actually had no ready answer, because the scene ends here. Hence, a final silence ends the scene of revolutionary education between man and woman. Perhaps the more insidious aspect of this conclusion, this kind of open-ended, complex, messy silence that we are left with, is the fact that the instruments of liberation and coercion are not separately formed. The redefinition of the personal that was necessitated by the revolution makes way for newer kinds of self-articulation, as well as novel modes of silencing for women. Thank you.
Thank you, Trina. We have one question from Sylvia already in the Q&A, but maybe I'll ask you a more general question about institutionality, because you've talked about these sort of relationships that don't quite fit between institutions of the state and how they relate to the context of artistic labor, the institution of bourgeois marriage, and indeed the movement as a kind of ongoing form of institution, or kind of anti-institutional institution. So I wondered about whether you might reflect on the ways in which institutionality plays a role here, and to what extent it's able to be resisted.
I mean, can I just ask you to repeat what, institutionality plays a role where in this particular, can you just kind of clarify that?
Yeah, I mean, sort of in this history that you've mapped for us, and the ways in which institutions are not quite mapping onto each other. And you seem to be talking a lot here about the kind of failure of revolution, or of developing a revolutionary formation successfully, and to what extent is that a problem of institutionality, I suppose, is my question.
Yeah, so this discussion about what an institution actually is forms a large part of one of the earlier chapters, where I actually try to define how the group theater is being imagined as a collective. And there are various ways in which, I'll come to the later question in a bit. So there are various ways in which the group theater constantly shifts between imagining itself as so in one of the earliest groups in the 1950s, they actually give themselves a constitution, like the Indian state does. So there's a constitution that Bahurapi gives itself, which must be followed. And in a sense, the members are seen as citizens who belong to this particular kind of mini nation in a way. But on the other hand, there are also kind of, so this whole tussle between what one would have called a sort of a community and an association, the Gesellschaft and the Gemeinschaft, that is constantly there. So but there are also sort of simultaneous invocations of the family and familial relations between sort of members of the group. But then also there is the notion in some senses where you have the idea that this is almost like a kind of an alternative space where the institutions of the nation can in fact be resisted, right? So all of these things happen in sort of conflicting, sometimes overlapping ways, which makes things quite difficult, in order to kind of, I think there's often sort of simultaneous invocations of very contradictory kind of notions of the collective. But so far as this particular chapter is concerned, you see, the thing is, this is why that is so important, is that he is not, unlike many others, diluting these questions in any way. The community is not an easy space for that. I mean, it's not, the revolutionary community also is kind of, deeply troubled by sort of internal, sort of internal violence, but also internal what I try to call the pathology of a certain kind. So in a sense, what that is trying to say is that there is a certain kind of institutionalism that does percolate there, because you have the vanguard figure. The leader is very much the middle class urban intellectual who's kind of, and Debari appears as a woman who can in fact be the organic intellectual and the leader, but there is a constant tussle between a certain kind of ossification that leads towards institution and a certain openness and flexibility which perhaps a woman like Debari represents, right? And that conflict then creates this revolutionary community, tears it apart, but also at times creates synergies that are in no way easy, but are complex, but energetic as well, I mean, at the same time. So I don't think there's an easy answer to this, but I would say that is definitely not one that would be one for a kind of institutional stability. He's rather looking to kind of open up the messy places rather. Yes, sorry, I don't know if that answered the questions.
It did, thank you. I'm going to go to Suradeep Roy in the Q&A, who's asking about the early moment in your lecture and the distinction Dutt makes between the revolutionary and the progressive play. Do you think that his understanding of a revolutionary play actually undermines the complex contradiction that his dramaturgy holds? The definition sounds very masculine, which I feel is at odds with his actual creative work, which questions masculinity.
Well, Shuradeep, thanks for that question. That's very, very important. You see, the thing with Dutt is that in this interview, like I say, the dates are very important. He's writing this in, he's giving this interview in 1970, and that phase of his life is a very complex and sort of, it shapes him in many ways. I mean, the late 60s till the early 70s, and it is a time of transition. I think you would find things articulated differently when you come towards a revolutionary theatre, or maybe in his later Bengali essays. There is a certain assertion here which I think that finds important to make at this point of time, because of the context within which he is speaking. And yes, it is much more, I would say you're right, much more limited than the range of a range of complexities and of contradictions that his plays allow for. So if you were to just take this interview and place it against, some of his plays, including, of course, Tir and the many others, Shonre Malik, many others, where this theme keeps coming back, and he's constantly, even Tinet Talwar, he's constantly sort of, shaking up sort of established notions of masculinity. And so this interview in itself would seem reductive in comparison. But if you actually were to put together his work and look at, his Bangla essays, for example, Jopinda, or, Chayar Dhua, and look at towards the revolutionary theatre even, you'd see many more complexities emerging. So this particular interview needs to be taken in its context. But also I think that articulation is important to understand, because he is making a transition from Ongar to Kollur. That's undeniable. He's definitely doing that. Kollur is a very, very different play from Ongar in terms of its intentions and even its dramaturgy. That's important. Yeah.
We've got a couple of questions about film, about Dutt's transition to film.
Yeah, but I didn't manage to read Sylvia's. Would you read it?
Shall I try to? I'll try to read Sylvia's, yes, and then we'll. Yeah, this is about the relationship between fictional characters functioning like as organic intellectuals in Dutt's work, and then his work as an actor in films, and and whether or not she's thinking specifically of Agantuk, um, and whether the figure there has aspects of the organic intellectual, and how does that relate to the moment when we find him in the forest with indigenous people? Is there some kind of love towards another kind of collectivity? She's referencing here Arundhati Roy's Walking with the Comrades. Is there a link between the actor, director, author Dutt and the character he plays in Ray's film, especially in relation to the middle class? Is there, if there is a notion of an organic intellectual in the film, how does it differ from Dutt's, especially in relation to gender? There's quite a lot to unpick there.
No, I wish I could know. I mean, given that Dutt's association with Ray was so so prolonged, and that they had worked together over different films at different times, I do want to believe that that's influence on that film might have been much more than that of just an actor who comes and sort of carries out a particular role. And if you remember so there is a Bengali short story from which it's actually more or less a young adult, so children's short story, from which the film emerges. The story is much more simple. The film then becomes a completely different kind of a sort of the film takes on a completely different kind of a discursive and ideological trajectory. And I'm not saying that I've watched the film with any intent to analyze it, but I do think that there is definitely the point that that's character in the film, in fact, tries to, in that huge long discussion that he has with this very arrogant sort of upper middle class man in the drawing room, where he's being constantly told that he's a charlatan, he's basically a hypocrite, he cannot really have lived the way he claims to have lived amongst the tribals. The assertion that is made again and again is that and I remember Borges's short story The Ethnographer, if you read it, where there's this constant feeling that that there are two incommensurable worlds, in fact. And for that's character there, the assertion is very clear, that it is not I who learned about them, but I who learned from them. And that I cannot, I'm quite aware, just like Fred Murdoch and Borges' story, that I cannot be one of them. And he says that that's my misfortune, that I cannot be one of them. And that in fact, that kind of constant assertion that there is, in fact, not just an empathy, not just an imagination of a symbiotic relationship, but a surrender of the arrogance of modernity, in a way, which might lead us to difficult directions, I understand, but that is also a way in which I think the vanguard is completely undone in that film. It's the figure of the vanguard is completely undone. And interestingly enough, Ghatak and Ray are constantly set against each other in the Bengali psyche. Ghatak is already, in his Jukti Toko Goppo and the play films from the 70s, has already encountered these problems in a different way. And it's interesting that Ray, who is constantly seen as the counterpart of Ghatak, comes back to these questions in his last film. And that's very, very interesting. I think there's a lot there, but I don't think I can manage to sort of address everything at the moment.
Vishnupriya has a question about performance.
There's Malarika's.
Oh yes, yes. Malarika is asking about the ways in which Dutt is engaging with love, desire, and sexuality differently, rather than using them as interchangeable terms. Could you reflect on those? On the relations between them, love, desire, and sexuality, a little more.
Right. So I think when I speak about Kollol and the debate that appears there, so at one level, like I said, there is, of course, the sort of decoupling and of course the resistance of traditional morality in the sphere of sexuality, and that there's this attempt to kind of dismantle that world. But in a sense, I skipped over the Manik Bandyopadhyay bit, and that is very important. I mean, that actually clarifies a lot of things. So in Chine Kaini Keno, which was a short story that was written by Chine Kaini Keno, translates as this was written about the Bengal famine. And it basically just addresses the question that many middle class progressive intellectuals had, that if the people were starving and there was food in the shops, why did they not break down the shops, grab the food and eat? Why didn't they just grab at the food? And the middle class moral answer to that was that they had the poor of this country are too moral to have done this. And Manik's answer is, who's a progressive writer, is that when you have been depleted bodily and psychologically and materially by the experience of famine, you do not have the strength to revolt. Just this, even the desire to revolt is born out of a certain kind of material um, sort of access to a certain kind of minimal resource that can keep you alive bodily, and that has every so that separation of the body and mind that we were talking about is completely undone in that understanding. How does this relate to love? In my understanding, in fact, what Manik is saying is that for love to become possible between Jogi Dagat. So the story in the story basically has a figure called Jogi Dagat, who's somewhat of a Robin Hood figure. If I'm just to give you a very kind of simplistic parallel from the West, he's a peasant who becomes a leader of a revolt amongst the peasants, and he is also he has been called by Shivaji Bandyopadhyay in his analysis a early figure of an organic intellectual. He, like many women from the peasant families during the famine, as we also see in Nobanno, his wife goes missing for months. When when he finally finds his wife, she's in one of the red light districts in the nearby town. She has been, trying to survive through sex work. And this was a reality for many women who kind of, sort of, even in Nobanno, there is an indication that, women actually survived through sex work, kept their children alive that way. And so when the whole story is told through the eyes of a middle class intellectual who finds Jogi Dakat's wife is pregnant and she has just returned to him a couple of weeks back, so this cannot be his child. And he knows that. But in the interaction between the man and the wife, between this sort of, this peasant revolutionary leader and his wife, there is no hint of discomfort, of a lack of understanding, of a lack of love. And this, the middle class activist finds difficult to understand. How is this possible? He must know that this woman who's heavily pregnant has been, in fact, quote unquote, prostituting herself for the last few months and is carrying somebody else's child. But between them, the love seems intense and completely without any kind of discomfort. And as they walk back to the nearby town and in the moonlight, Jogi Dakat walks confidently in the darkness, and this man keeps stumbling. And his stumbling actually sort of represents his middle class moral stumbling as well. And at one point, Jogi Dakat turns to him and says that, "What are you thinking about? I understand this seems strange to you, but did she not eat in whichever way she could? Did she not save herself so that she could see me again?" And that, to him, is an instance of love. So in a sense, to answer Malarika's question, the idea is that cultural transformation, which is both sort of about sexual morality, about ideological transformation, about how to organize desire, which cannot be talked about without talking about power, is what makes possible this love. Without understanding this, so love is not something that can be understood, at least in this trajectory for me, amorphously, without thinking about ideological considerations of how sexuality and desire are ordered. It is once that cultural transformation happens that, in fact, Jogi and his wife have a kind of love that this middle class man cannot even fathom, cannot imagine. Right. So in fact, these three questions are interlinked. So one has to understand how sexual morality is reordered in order to understand the possibility of this kind of love, which can actually, without the batting of an eyelid, take the fact that one's wife has been a sex worker for the last 1 year and is carrying someone else's child, and still, move into a space where love seems possible. So without the understanding of these ideological imperatives, I think love cannot be, I mean, in these contexts, we read in any kind of vacuum. That's my understanding.
The description of the stumbling leads me neatly to what Bishnupriya is asking, which is about performance text and the work of performance. She asks, since your work does focus on the actresses of the group theatre, what do performances and performance texts, how do they work in relation to the representation of revolutionary love?
So all of this is the one of the major things is that my work ends in the late 70s. It ends with 1980s. So what I do have mostly is in terms of what allows me to reach what the performance text was. Interviews, some anecdotal information, or sort of elements that I already draw from whatever autobiographical work that exists in sort of the actress's own memoirs. And that appears in the last chapter, but most importantly, it actually appears in the second chapter, where I talk about Bohurupi and Bohurupi's adaptation of A Doll's House in the late 50s. And I actually do a sort of comparative analysis of Ibsen's text and the Shambhu Mitra's adaptation, but it doesn't end there. I had subsequently actually interviewed Professor Shomik Bandyopadhyay, who was one of the early sort of members in the audience who saw the original production. And to me, initially, when I read the Putul Khela, which is the Bangla version of Doll's House, it appeared to me quite progressive. But when I spoke to Shomik Bandyopadhyay, he gave me elements of what the performance had done, which actually becomes very difficult to decipher from the text itself. Even the text of the adaptation, which has very detailed stage directions and all that. So basically, in Putul Khela, there is the structure of the play was kind of this, and the stage design consisted of these arched doorways, which represented the house of Torvald and Nora, Topon and Bulu in Bengali. And instead of the slamming of the door that we find in Doll's House, where Nora just slams at the door, and we've got this famous saying that it kind of echoed through Europe, that slamming of the door. Bulu actually wipes off her Shidur, which for a Hindu wife, quote unquote, for a Hindu middle class woman, wife, so signified denying the life and existence of her husband, because that's what widows do. And Tripti Mitra writes in her sort of, it's not a full-fledged memoir, but these are reminiscences of her performance. She writes that she remembers clearly that in the first show in Mahajati Shodhan, there was a collective gasp from the audience, because this was a largely, middle class, largely Hindu, urban audience. And she said there was utter silence, and I could actually hear the gasp coming from, especially the women in the audience. So she wipes off her shidur and leaves. And this basically means that I consider you dead. That's what it means if you were to read it semiotically. And she writes that. So that's what the one clue I have about the performance text. But when I speak to Shomik Bandyopadhyay, it seemed to me really, really radical, of course, when I read Tripti Mitra's memoirs. And Shomik Bandyopadhyay told me, who's a drama critic and a very, very sort of senior scholar, he told me that the play doesn't end there. You see, Bulu leaves, that's Nora leaves, and then the play lingers on the body of Torvald, who is now literally a broken man and has arched himself over, and the lights go down in order to actually turn his body into a silhouette, and suddenly his arched body reflects the arches on the set. So you realize at that point of time that those arches were put in place from the very start, so that the final image of the play would not be Nora's rebellion, but this man who has been broken by her rejection. So you, in fact, I feel are left finally with this sense of pity for Torvald, rather than admiration and perhaps anxiety for Nora, who has now stepped into a space which is a no space at all for a 1950s urban middle class woman. There is no space in the understanding of the liberal democratic state for the single woman who in fact does not belong to a home and a family. And that understanding, and I discuss at length how the understanding of citizenship actually almost literally changes from imagining women as autonomous economic individuals to imagining women as parts of family, units as maternal figures. So the 5-year plans, in fact, reflect this transition in the first decade of India's independence. So in a sense, you have then emotionally and affectively, the performance text gives you a very different picture than the printed adaptation will give you a sense of, or even Tripti Mitra's own memoirs. She's the lead actress. She gives you a sense. There is that collective gasp. That there is a receding from that sort of radical step into a space where you end up really feeling sorry for the man left behind, rather than feeling anxiety, admiration, or anything else for the woman who leaves. So that's one example, but I'm sure there are others that I can.
Thank you. Yeah, it's like the men's movement critique, that men are the victims of patriarchy. So his body is twisted by the forms of patriarchy. And yeah, interesting, very interesting. Thank you, Trina. There's loads more I'd like to ask you about this, particularly about this relationship between Maoism and Gramscianism as I read it, and this sort of Dutt caught between the two of them. But I think we're out of time, so that we'll have to wait for another day. Thank you for a brilliant presentation. I thoroughly recommend that everybody read Performing Silence: Women in the Group Theatre Movement in Bengal, which will be out end of the month-ish, we think, from OUP.
He said to me 20th June, and now they're saying there's some internal debate about pricing, so it might be a week more, but definitely by early July then.
Pre-order, everybody. Yep. And thank you very much, Trina, for a brilliant presentation and discussion. Thank you all very much for coming and for your questions. It's been a huge pleasure. So we now get the abrupt Zoom ending. Thank you all, and see you again soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you, John. Thanks a lot.